Hello, and welcome to Counseling Ethics Lecture 19. My name is Dr. Amber Hughes. In this lecture, I want to talk about boundary issues. Boundary issues encompasses a wide range of questions. For example, is it ethically appropriate to accept a gift from a client? Should I become friends with a client? Can I meet a client outside of the office? All of these things are issues that we may come across as counselors, and they demonstrate potential boundary issues that we may have. First, though, we need to know what a boundary is. A boundary is a therapeutic relationship that is bound by a frame. And so the relationship is a big part of counseling, and we have to protect it. And we have to make sure that we are keeping it safe and keeping it from encroaching on other areas of our life and our client's life in order to make sure that we are doing the best that we possibly can to serve our clients. Now, counselors may engage in some behaviors with clients that have the potential for creating a dual relationship, but are not in themselves dual relationships. And we'll talk about dual relationships in the next lecture. These behaviors are described as boundary crossings. A boundary crossing is a departure from a commonly accepted practice that occurs to benefit a client. The boundary is shifted to meet the needs of a particular client at a particular moment. A violation, however, is a serious breach that causes harm. An occasional boundary crossing probably can be justified when there is benefit to the client and very little risk of harm. Counselors, however, should not let these crossings become routine, because then they can become dual relationships. For example, a counselor decided to attend her client's college graduation ceremony. This counselor's behavior does not constitute an ongoing dual relationship and could have the potential to enhance the therapeutic relationship. So whenever you have instances like this, you always want to keep the client first in your mind. Is this potentially beneficial to the client? How much harm might this cause? So there are some instances where you might decide that a boundary crossing is appropriate and would be helpful to the client. Always keeping the client first. Next, we'll look at some areas for potential boundary issues. First is bartering. Now, I'm not sure how common this is, and when I talk about this in face-to-face classes, usually students get a little chuckle out of the idea of bartering. But I imagine in more rural areas, this could potentially be an issue. So bartering is when we trade clients' services for either goods or other services. And this is not prohibited by the ethical standards of the counseling profession, but it is discouraged as a routine practice. Now, according to Standard A10D, counselors may participate in bartering if the relationship is not exploitive or harmful and does not place the counselor in an unfair advantage. So if you're not trying to take advantage of your client, then it's generally not a bad thing. If your client requests it, let's say they're running low on cash, but they I'm laughing because the example I used in one of my classes, I think, was about chicken or eggs. If your client has some fresh eggs, they want to trade you for services and they bring it in. And we got a kick out of that idea. So that might be an example. You might also have clients who provide services themselves. So let's say you have a client who is in construction and you need some remodeling done to your home, and he's like, hey, what if we trade services and you provide me or someone in my family counseling for X amount of hours, and I do X amount of work for you, right? So that might be an instance where you would barter for services. You only do this again if the client requests it, and if the arrangements are an accepted practice among professionals in the community. Again, I'm thinking in some fairly rural areas, this might be common practice, and so that would be totally fine. In other areas, you might be less inclined to do something like this, though. Along the lines of bartering, that's probably a more common practice is accepting gifts from clients. Although bartering, excuse me, bartering is common enough to have its own place in the code of ethics, right? All right, accepting gifts from clients. Standard 10E says that counselors understand the challenges of accepting gifts from clients and recognize that in some cultures, small gifts are a token of respect and showing gratitude. When trying to determine whether or not to accept a gift from client, counselors take into account the therapeutic relationship, the monetary value of the gift, a client's motivation for giving the gift, the counselor's motivation for wanting or declining the gift. So again, always keeping the client's welfare at the forefront of any decision we make. I'm thinking of maybe an example of a client you might have who maybe you are wondering, let's say it's a client of who has suggested that they may have some feelings for you, maybe some sort of sexual attraction, and they bring you a piece of jewelry or something as a gift. I would not accept something like that. That wouldn't maybe be super appropriate in terms of the type of gift. Probably the monetary value wouldn't be appropriate, and the motivation for giving the gift is not appropriate. Maybe they're wanting to start a relationship with you. You also want to make sure that your motivation for wanting or declining the gift is appropriate as well. So let's say you really, really want that piece of jewelry. It's gorgeous and you know the client can afford it, and what could it hurt? That would be motivation for your own purposes, not for what's best for the client. So in those instances, or something like that. So that's how you would go about considering, right? About making your decision, thinking about all those things. Versus, I'm thinking of one student I had in particular when I was an academic advisor who brought me a gift. Now she and I had been working together for like 2 years. She had had me in several classes, and these were like psychoeducational classes, so they were fairly personal. And then I also met with her very regularly. So we had a really good relationship. She was, I don't remember if she brought this for me for Christmas or maybe she was getting ready to change. Once students declared their major, they left me and went to another advisor. So that might have been why she brought it. Anyway, she just brought a little, one of those little, I think they're called willow tree figures. I don't know if you've seen them. It's just a little figurine. It probably costs $10 to $20. And it was a little angel, and the angel was holding a little sign that said thank you. Super sweet. It was appropriate. It was a token of respect. It was showing gratitude. And this is where I've found that more often than not, gifts come into play as kind of a sign of closure for the relationship. So anytime I've received a gift, it's been to end the relationship, and I think that that's appropriate. And sometimes I'll even bring small tokens to end maybe a group or to end the relationship, because for me, it's something that you can take away, and you can. It's just a nice way to kind of close a relationship, especially when that means a lot to both people involved. And so that's appropriate. It wasn't too much. It was something that was meaningful to both of us, but it was also appropriate, and so I accepted it. So there are some gifts that are totally appropriate, and that you might choose to accept. Again, you're going through the process, though, to make that decision. All right, now I want to look at some relationships that may present boundary issues. Again, we're not really getting into dual relationship territory here. Not yet, anyway. All right, so business or financial relationships. This could involve the counselor paying for a client's expertise or assistance. This could be a counselor and client joining areas of expertise to produce income. This could be a counselor patronizing a client's place of business or a counselor selling goods to clients. Counselors should avoid entering these relationships with current or former clients. However, in my opinion, this could prove to be a problem in more rural or geographically isolated areas. Now, some of them, like counselor and client joining areas of expertise to produce income, that's easily avoidable. You don't have, that's a choice you're making. However, let's say you go out to eat and there's, 2 places to eat in town, and your client happens to own or work at one of those places. It would be hard to avoid that situation, I think, unless you just never go out to eat. Or there's going to be some instances where you don't necessarily know it, right? You don't know that person owns that particular restaurant. So for example, a specific example, in my small hometown, my parents own a cleaning business, and they have a contract to clean all of the mental health agencies in town. The community agencies are all part of the hospital system, so they technically have a contract with the hospital, and the hospital tells them where to clean, but they clean these agencies. My brothers work for my parents. It's a family business. So they clean those agencies. Both of my brothers, or 2 of my brothers, I have 3, 2 of my brothers also get counseling from this agency. Definitely an ethical no-no, right? However, nobody that has ever raised this as an issue, as far as I know, with my brothers. My first thought is, oh my gosh, how is this even going on? Because my brother will clean the office of his therapist, of his psychiatrist. And I'm thinking, no, right? The more I think about the issue, though, the more I see potential for this being a decision maybe the counselor has made to let it slide. Okay, so there are no other options for counseling services or psychiatrists in town. Now, my brothers could go somewhere else. However, whenever you get into, these rural areas, these small towns, if the counselor were to say, it's not appropriate for us to provide services for you because you have this contract, it would leave them without any services in town in terms of their mental health. So 2 potential ethical dilemmas are going on here, right? And that's when we would go through the ethical decision-making model. The other option that I see is that they break the contract and say, we can't have you cleaning our business whenever we are providing services for people in your family. Again, a huge issue because that's a big chunk of my parents' income. And so if they were to break that contract over this, that would be really damaging to my family. So likely they've gone through this process and determined that this is an ethical no-no, that is the best possible option for this situation. Okay. And so I think you're going to have, again, in my experience, I think you're going to have issues like this that are messy and confusing whenever you are living and working in like really small towns or rural areas where it's just hard to keep things nice and separate in terms of our relationships with our clients. Next, let's talk about social relationships. Again, we're talking about dual relationships next, so we're not really touching on dual relationships here. All right, so individuals who choose to become professional counselors do not cease to be members of their communities, nor are they expected to forego their social lives in order to avoid all non-professional contacts with clients. When counselors blend the roles of friend and counselor, however, they create a conflict of interest that compromises the objectivity needed for sound professional judgment. So we really want to avoid those dual relationships because of this. We're trying to, again, protect that therapeutic relationship. Counselors, according to our code of ethics, must avoid personal virtual relationships, so being friends with people on social media. And counselors must avoid entering into non-professional relationships with former clients, romantic partners, or their family members. Counselors also have an ethical obligation to keep their professional and personal or social lives as separate as they reasonably can. So we really strive to keep our professional and personal lives as separate as possible. Okay? And even our professional lives as separate as and as distinct as possible. Counselors should definitely not get their social needs or personal needs for friendship met through interactions with their clients. So you shouldn't be shopping for friends from your clientele. And the Code of Ethics, however, offers no guidance regarding post-termination friendships with clients. And there is no consensus among helping professionals regarding the advisability of such relationships. All right. So it may be possible for you to be friends with a client after you have terminated the relationship. That would pose an ethical dilemma, however, and so you would want to go through the ethical decision-making model whenever you're making that decision. Some specific factors to consider when befriending a former client: the time that has passed since termination, transference, and countertransference issues that occurred during the counseling relationship that may be impacting your decision to be friends with that person. The length and nature of counseling. Obviously, the longer you were engaged in a counseling relationship and the more intense the nature of counseling, the less advisable it would be to become friends with a client. Client issues and diagnoses, circumstances of the termination, client's freedom of choice. So you don't want to be pushing the issue, kind of like with bartering. You don't want to be the one to really instigate something where your client would feel like they had to be friends with you. Whether any exploitation might have occurred in the professional relationship, the client's ego strength and mental health, if they're at a good place, if they have some good supports, and are able to make a good choice about whether to be your friend, you would be more likely to consider befriending a former client. Possibility of reactivation of counseling. If there's a chance that they may come back to you, you want to avoid the relationship. And whether any harm to the client's welfare can be foreseen. Obviously, you want to avoid harm. And so I'm thinking of a couple of examples. Again, just going back to like my hometown or the places I've lived that are really small rural areas. And I'm thinking that this may be something that happens. Okay. So I'm thinking of, let's say, there's a yoga class in town that you really want to attend, and you've been avoiding it though, because you were working with, someone who also attends that class. And you wanted to avoid that social interaction. Well, you have since terminated with that client. It's been a couple of years, and now you're thinking again, hey, maybe it could be time that I would go, I could go to that class, knowing that there's a chance you may interact with your client and even become friends with them. You may have had, I know I've had clients that I just hit it off with immediately. And I know, because I can think of these people, I've thought, man, if this were if I had met this person in a different situation, I would totally be friends with them. We just have a lot in common. I enjoy talking to them and so on. So, there's a chance you might be friends with this client if you attend that class. You would go through, again, the ethical decision-making model, but also think about these things. Let's say you met with them briefly. It was maybe like 10 to 15 sessions. It was about kind of a developmental issue. Maybe they were going through some changes and had some subsequent stress surrounding those changes, and you worked with them through that process. So it was kind of a less intense counseling relationship. Or maybe you were doing career counseling like I do. You might be more likely to say, hey, yeah, this would be totally cool. I'll go to the class. It won't be a big deal. Versus, let's say you were counseling someone for a couple of years and it was a fairly intense diagnosis. Maybe they were going through some addiction and maybe even some comorbid diagnoses, and so you had some really intense work with them. It might be just super uncomfortable for you to be friends with them because maybe you have a counseling relationship that was just really intense and not at a good time in their life. So those are things you would want to consider. Also along these lines, let's say you go to that yoga class not knowing your client's going to be there, or you go to that restaurant not knowing that your client owns it. You might see clients in public. Maybe it's just at the grocery store. You want to try and foresee this happening, especially, again, if you live in a town with one grocery store. Chances are it's going to happen. So you want to discuss this during informed consent. Hey, what happens if we see each other out and about in public? So it is considered breaking confidentiality to acknowledge clients in public. So if you say hi to your client first, then you're breaking confidentiality, right? Because you're acknowledging that you know this person, and how do you know them in a therapeutic way. So you don't do that, and you talk about this in informed consent. I'm not going to acknowledge you in public. It's my policy. It would be breaking confidentiality. So if we see each other, don't feel offended if I don't say hi to you. However, your client is free to talk to you, so they can break that confidentiality. So you might you might include that. If you want to say hi to me, that would be fine and appropriate. You also want to think about, and I'm thinking about certain clients that may be more likely to just treat, anytime they see you, treat this as an extra counseling session. So you would want to talk about boundaries, especially with certain clients. If we do run into each other in public, then there are certain things that would be okay to talk about and certain things that wouldn't be okay to talk about. So it's up to us as counselors to really create and enforce those boundaries with clients, because they aren't counselors, and so they may not understand the importance of them, and they may not know how to do boundaries really well. That may be one of the issues they have, and so it's our job, even though it may be hard, because we're nice people and we want to help people. It may be hard to enforce these boundaries with certain clients in certain spaces, but it is up to us to do so. All right, finally, I want to end with self-disclosure and client contact. So self-disclosure is when counselors disclose about ourselves. Okay, so this could be sharing like a personal story. It could be sharing our personal opinion or our thoughts about something. Self-disclosures that are ethically appropriate are done for the client's benefit within the context of the therapeutic process. Now, there's some theoretical orientations that include an amount of self-disclosure of the counselors by way of counselors expressing their own feelings or thoughts about the client's situation. That's done within the context of the theory and is done for the client's benefit. However, with most I can't even think of one theoretical orientation that would involve clients or that would involve counselors really talking a whole lot about ourselves in terms of like sharing stories or sharing our own experiences. And so it's something you want to be careful of, and you want to use intentionally and sparingly. Unethical self-disclosures are used to meet the counselor's own needs for intimacy or understanding. So anytime you're shifting the focus of a session from your client to you, that's getting into unethical self-disclosures. So maybe you've experienced something similar to your client. You might share briefly, I have also experienced a loss and I know how hard it is. That might be more ethical. You're expressing empathy, but you're keeping the focus to your client. Versus, I've also experienced this loss and I'm having a hard time dealing with it myself, and maybe you go on and on. That's getting into unethical territory, And so you want to avoid that. Whenever you're shifting that focus from your client to you, that's when it becomes an issue. Now, physical contact with clients is also something that's going to come up, especially if you are more of a touchy-feely kind of person or your client is. And it can be fine. So a reassuring touch or a gentle hug can be facilitative, especially if your client's going through something intense or they're processing some deep emotions. For me, it might be kind of weird not to touch. And I'm talking about, a pat on the arm or a pat on the back. That's expressing empathy and thank you. She just keeps coming. All right, I'm going to try and finish this up. So a reassuring touch, like an appropriate touch, is helpful and, like I said, can be facilitative. Counselors engaging in these behaviors, however, risk having their gestures misinterpreted as sexual advances or as violations of the client's personal space. And so you should be cautious about making physical contact with your clients. It should be appropriate. It should be not a lot, not overwhelming, especially with clients you may not know very well. Hug a client only when the client requests it. Okay, so don't go in for the hug first, or if the counselor secures the client's permission. I remember in my group counseling class, we had a group in the class, and I was talking about, I think my grandpa was having some medical problems at the time, and I was getting upset, and our teacher was facilitating the group, and he said, I want to give you a hug right now. Is that okay? And I was like, yeah. It sounds weird, but it wasn't at all. It was fine. So those kinds of conversations are appropriate to have. You also want to pay attention to diversity considerations in touching clients. Cultures vary widely regarding hugging and touching. So make sure that you are going to the client first and seeing how they respond to any form of touch, or asking if it's okay, if they're comfortable with you touching or hugging. Also consider the age of the client. I'm thinking I've not done a lot of counseling with young kids, but I substitute taught for elementary school kids, and it was impossible to keep them from touching me. Kids are touchy. It's and not in a bad way. Some kids, obviously, inappropriate touch is going to indicate some larger issues, but it was totally common for, at the end of the day, for the kids to come up and give me a hug. That's going to be more appropriate and less awkward than, let's say, if you're working with adolescent boys. It might be super awkward to do a whole lot of touch with that type of population. Although I'm thinking of, and this is my last example, when I worked at the alternative school, I remember our last day of school with this population, and there were several kids that I worked with all year and had a very strong relationship with, and one guy who it totally blew me away. I remember at the end of the year, he came up and he grabbed me in this big bear hug, and it was like this, it totally threw me off because he was not a very emotional or touchy person. So it was kind of an awkward hug, but it was definitely appropriate. And it was like it was a hug to say goodbye, because we knew that we wouldn't see each other again. I wasn't coming back. He wasn't coming back. And so, but he initiated it. Okay. So hug it or touch isn't bad. Okay. It can be helpful. It can be facilitative. You just want to keep it in context and be careful with it.